Welcome to the MamasteFit Podcast. On today's episode, we will be discussing how to support your early postpartum rehab, how to return to fitness after birth, and our personal journeys after birth. Welcome to the MamasteFit Podcast. This is Gina, perinatal fitness trainer and birth doula.
And this is Roxanne, labor and delivery nurse and student midwife.
And this is the MamasteFit Podcast, where we empower you on your prenatal fitness, birth, and postpartum return to fitness journey.
Our podcast shares how to move throughout your pregnancy to stay strong and comfortable. Pain is not a requirement of pregnancy. Understand the science of birth and how to approach recovery after birth.
We share our personal experiences as mothers navigating the stage of lives, plus our professional expertise as birth workers and fitness professionals.
Our goal is to help you feel confident as you navigate the perinatal timeframe for an empowering pregnancy, positive birth, and postpartum journey.
We are glad to have you with us on this journey and that you've chosen us to support you. Approaching a return to fitness after birth can feel pretty daunting. Likely at your all-clear postpartum appointment, there isn't much guidance in how to return to your pre-pregnancy workouts. Maybe the advice was just to ease back into it, lift a little bit lighter of weight, to maybe run a mile instead of 10. And it's a little unfair to expect our providers to be the expert in every aspect of our lives, to include how we return to fitness. And so there are other professionals out there who could potentially be more helpful for you when it comes to returning to fitness, such as a perinatal fitness instructor or a pelvic floor physical therapist. So let's start with day one postpartum. So you just gave birth. Roxanne, what can we do to immediately support our healing after birth?
For the first 24 hours, we want to rest as much as possible. So laying in the bed, if you're in the hospital, you can get up out of the bed and kind of walk around the room, but ideally trying to stay as much in the bed as possible, using ice packs and comfort measures for the discomfort. So if you had a vaginal birth, ice packs on the vagina and the perineum for 24 to 48 hours, using perineal sprays. And then if you had a C-section, using items to support the incision. So you can use belly bands or even perineal support devices. So external perineal support devices like the Mama Strut or the Bowbabe Bloomers are really nice for both C-sections and vaginal births, can feel really supportive. Taking the over-the-counter medications for pain relief, because we will have some cramping postpartum because the uterus was really large and needs to clamp down to return to its usual size, which is about the size of our fist. And that can take a couple days. And then rest, so hydrate and eat also. Nourishing foods is ideal, so not going to McDonald's for every single meal during your postpartum, especially that first 24 hours, is better, but also try to eat something. So if that's all that's available to you, then that's better than nothing. But I can also tell you what not to do in your postpartum, which is go shopping for a TV at 2 days postpartum after your newborn baby's visit. Not ideal, especially if you're choosing to baby wear that entire time and your baby is 8 pounds. Maybe don't go to a wedding at 1 week postpartum where you're still bleeding from your body and figuring out breastfeeding. And then maybe, as much as I preach that a CPR class is really beneficial as a parent, maybe not doing it 1 week postpartum is a good idea. So those are just some ideas. Not saying that that's what I did, but that is what I did. So don't do what I did.
So in addition to kind of the medical aspect of caring for our body in that early postpartum period, we can also begin to reconnect with our pelvic floor and our core even before the all clear. So we're not necessarily running to the gym and working out before we get clearance from our provider or before our bleeding has stopped. But we can do some gentle movement to begin that rehabilitation process, because 4 to 6 weeks is too long to do nothing, but less than that is also too little to jump right back into a fitness program. And so what we can do to help reconnect with our pelvic floor and our core in these early days is we can begin with gentle diaphragmatic breathing, even on day one postpartum.
Can you explain what diaphragmatic breathing is?
So what diaphragmatic breathing is our diaphragm is at the bottom of our rib cage. So it's the bottom of the thoracic cavity where our lungs reside. And then our pelvic floor is at the bottom of our pelvic cavity. And so these two muscles are moving together to regulate the pressure within our thoracic cavity and within our abdominal cavity. And so when we do diaphragmatic breathing, we're working with the entire core system to stabilize the spine as we regulate pressure within our torso. And so when I take a big inhale, my diaphragm is going to flatten as it moves down. And that downward pressure is increasing pressure within the abdominal cavity. So it's decreasing the volume, which is going to increase that pressure. That's going to be decreasing the pressure within the lungs so that we can pull air into our lungs. And so we're not necessarily like sucking air in, but the lower pressure gradient within our thoracic cavity is what kind of pulls the air into our lungs. Then when I have that inhale that moves the diaphragm down, so it's flattening and spreading out, it's increasing pressure within the abdominal cavity. And so our abdominal wall, our back are going to expand outwards, and then our pelvic floor is going to load and lengthen and move downwards as well. And so as the diaphragm moves down, everything else is also kind of moving down and out as well. And then when we exhale, in the early postpartum period, we kind of have two options with the exhalation. We can either just exhale and completely relax and allow everything to kind of recoil back in. So if you think about like a rubber band, so I'm pulling the rubber band and I'm stretching it. When I let go of the rubber band, if it doesn't fling into my finger and hurt me, it is going to come back together. And so that's kind of what we're doing with our exhalation. We're just lengthening and stretching and kind of gathering energy with our inhalation. And then we exhale to release or to relax. And it's just going to recoil kind of back into the resting positions. And so one thing that we can do with the exhale is just to relax and to release. And then the other thing that we can do is we can add some activation. And so we can exhale to lift the pelvic floor up and in. So kind of like that Kegel or pelvic floor activation type movement. So if you think about like a blueberry, you're picking up a blueberry with your vagina and lifting it up and in without crushing it. The abdominal wall and the back are going to come inwards, and all of that muscular force is going to kind of push the diaphragm back up as well. And so inhales, diaphragm moves down, it increases pressure in the abdominal cavity, which is going to respond with the abdominal wall and the back and the pelvic floor, which are all going to load and lengthen. This gathering of energy is a state of tension, so inhales are not relaxed. It's a state of tension, similar if I was stretching like my hamstring or any other muscle in my body. The stretching position would not necessarily be a relaxed position unless you were like super flexible, I guess, which it would not be a state of tension. The exhale is where we relax. So inhales increase pressure. Exhales are either going to release and recoil back in, or we're going to exhale to add muscular force, which is going to help stabilize the spine. And so in the early postpartum period, we can inhale to gently expand and kind of move the pelvic floor and the diaphragm. And this is also going to move our abdominal wall and our back. And then we can exhale to gently kind of lift up and in. And so this is a very, very gentle movement initially. I'm not trying to find my deepest inhalation and my strongest exhalation. I would say it's like 40 to 50%. So we're just expanding, and then we're inhaling to expand, and we're exhaling to lift up and in. And this is our first core work that we can do postpartum, and we can do it in different positions, such as laying on your back, laying on your side. Finding a position that's really comfortable for you in these early days is going to be a great way to incorporate some initial rehab work. And you can do it like every time you feed your baby, whether you're breastfeeding or formula feeding or bottle feeding. Like as you're feeding your baby, we can think about, okay, I'm going to inhale, move my diaphragm down as I expand in my back side. So think more like the ribs are expanding out, the back is expanding out as opposed to the belly. And then you're going to feel the back half of that pelvic floor kind of load and lengthen gently. And then I'm going to exhale to lift up and in, and just a gentle contraction. So I'm going to inhale to feel everything kind of expand, and then exhale to lift up and in. And you can do this every time you feed your baby as your first way to reconnect with your core after birth.
Beyond breathing and using these diaphragmatic breathing techniques, how can someone approach their healing before they receive that all clear from their provider?
Generally, we want to focus on 5 days in the bed, 5 days on the bed, and then 5 days near the bed. And so this may or may not be realistic for you depending on the type of support that you have, like whether or not you have paid maternity leave, whether or not your partner has paid maternity leave. But in the perfect world, we can really focus on just resting the first 2 weeks postpartum. And so the first 5 days, we're generally laying in bed and allowing for that initial tissue healing to happen. And so birth is a trauma that happens to our tissues, to our pelvic floor, to our body, regardless if you had a vaginal birth, unmedicated at home, no interventions, or if you had a cesarean birth where you pushed for 6 hours. And so birth is still a traumatic event that happens to our bodies, and it requires a lot of healing in those early days. So if we can spend the first 5 days mostly just in bed, focusing and bonding on baby, that would be great. And again, that's in an ideal world where you have other people to help support you in the early days that allow you to really just focus on laying in bed. The next 5 days are going to be like on the bed. So you're starting to like get up out of bed and move a little bit more around like your house. Maybe you're doing like a little bit more, but still generally like on or like right next to the bed. The first 5 days, you're not just laying in bed and doing nothing. Like you can obviously get up and like shower and use the bathroom and things like that and like go eat at the table. But like we're kind of mostly focusing on staying off our feet these first like 10 days. And then we move into the final 5 days of this initial rest period where we're just staying near the bed. And so at this point, you can get up and probably like move around your house a whole lot more. We're increasing our activity. Maybe we're going for short walks. As we begin to increase our activity over these first 15 days, we're really monitoring our bleeding. So around like day 7 through 10, the placental scab detaches and you might have increased bleeding for like a few hours, but it shouldn't be like the whole day. Like you might just notice that your bleeding has picked up and then after a few hours, it goes back to where it was before. If your bleeding increases after increased activity, this could be related to doing too much too soon. And so we can really use our bleeding as a tool to help us better understand whether or not we're doing too much or where we can potentially like quote unquote like push ourselves a little bit more in these early days. And so the first 2 weeks, we're mostly focusing on staying in the bed or near the bed, doing a lot of those diaphragmatic breathing drills and mobility. So thinking like being on your back, side lying, all fours. If you had a vaginal tear, you may find that wide leg positions or sitting on your bottom doesn't feel great. If you had a C-section, you may find twisting movements, bending over or arching or laying on your belly doesn't feel great. And so in these early days, exploring movement very gently and exploring how it feels for you and your body is really important. So what felt really good for me in my body is different from what felt really good for Roxanne and what may feel different for you. And it's okay. And so these early days is just kind of like, how does this position feel for you? Do you feel like it's restorative for you or do you feel like you're straining or stretching within it? During the first 2 weeks, we are just really focusing on allowing our body to heal. And again, there was a lot of tissue trauma that occurred during our birth. And so staying off our feet as much as possible is helpful. And then focus on the only me task. So like you are the only one that can accomplish this task. And I don't mean like you're the only one that can do dishes or do bedtime. I mean like you're the only one that can shower for you. Like no one else can take a shower for you. No one else can eat for you. And no one else sadly can sleep for you. It would be so helpful if someone else could just take a nap for me.
Or eat for me.
Or eat for me. That would be wonderful. So focusing on the only me tasks in the first 2 weeks can really help you focus on your own healing. So the dishes and the chores can wait, which was really hard for me the early postpartum because I like really like my house to be in a certain state of organization because it stresses me out when like things are all over the place. And so for me,
so Gina's always stressed out.
I know. So I don't know, seriously, because I love slime and sand for my children. So for me, like letting go that it's okay if the toys are not put back in the correct bin every night and allowing like other family members to kind of manage that was really important so that I could just like let go and focus on my own healing those first few days. And so you can maybe even you're pausing like your kids' activities, like, hey, we're not going to go to swimming this week, or, you know, coordinating with other family members and friends to support household tasks, going to your kids' appointments and activities, managing your pets. So planning during your pregnancy, who's going to manage those different activities, such as the kids, the pets, different appointments, household chores, is really, really helpful and something that I would recommend doing before you even give birth.
So we talked a lot about physically what you can do in your body to support your recovery, but nourishment is something we haven't talked about yet that is also super important for our postpartum recoveries. So how can we support our nourishment requirement for postpartum recovery? Meal train, meal prepping before birth. Either of those things are great ways to support our nourishment. Fed and Fit has a really awesome postpartum meal plan that you can literally just Google, and we'll include them in our show notes. DoorDash is what kind of my go-to, or Uber Eats, that I use during my postpartum. So a really great thing you can ask for at baby showers or after baby has arrived is if family members or friends want to support you in the postpartum, they can just buy you a gift card for DoorDash or Uber Eats so that you can buy still nourishing food, but you don't have to cook it. And then another great option is if you have a meal delivery service local to your area, you can Google it. Usually everywhere that I've lived, there is some sort of meal delivery service that will give you deliver to your front door homemade meals for you, and they're usually pretty delicious. We have a local business, Spoon Liquors, if you're local to the Sandhills area, Aberdeen, Southern Pines areas. They are amazing. We've used them for all of our postpartums that we've been in North Carolina. They also just started a subscription, so you don't even have to remember to place your order weekly. It'll just arrive on your doorstep every Tuesday night. They do gift cards, which was pretty solid because you can just like you can ask for DoorDash gift cards. If you're local to us, you can ask for Spoon Liquors gift cards.
Another consideration for the early postpartum period will be kind of cultural expectations, depending on where you come from or where your family comes from. So our mom is very passionate about our early postpartum healing. She is from South Korea, and she immigrated to the United States in the early 80s. And when she was growing up, postpartum healing was really emphasized. And I think it still is a really big deal in Korea, but it might be a little bit less now that we're all a little bit more westernized. And so in South Korea, when she was growing up, it was eating lots of seaweed soup, which has a lot of iron within it. It's a very nutriently dense broth. Only eating hot foods, so nothing cold. She wouldn't let us drink ice water or there was
ice cream. I wasn't allowed to have a bowl of ice cream.
There's this belief that cold foods can inhibit your healing, which I see to be pretty common in various Eastern cultures. Lots of rest, so don't do anything other than feed the baby, and then lots of family support. And so we're really fortunate because we live right next to our mom and our dad. We live next to each other, and so we have a lot of family support between the three families. And so in Korean culture, this postpartum healing phase where you're really cared for lasts from 1 to 3 months. And it's essentially the 4th trimester. And so our mom just makes tons of seaweed soup for us to eat. Every time she'd leave the house, she would call my husband and be like, "Did you feed Gina seaweed soup? She needs to eat seaweed soup to heal." And then she would text him in the morning and be like, "Make sure you heat up seaweed soup for Gina before you leave for work."
And when we say she is feeding us seaweed soup, I mean you're eating seaweed soup for breakfast, lunch, and dinner if she was there to feed it to you. I ate seaweed soup for a month straight. I literally cannot physically eat any more of this. I know it is delicious and I'm supposed to, but I need to eat something else, Mom, please.
So in addition to our mom providing a lot of support in the early postpartum, because she was also helping us give our baby a bath so that we can rest, and holding the baby while we took a shower. And she's just phenomenal in every way. And I hope she listens to this podcast to know that we could not survive without her. But our partners also play a really big role in supporting us in the early postpartum period because we're the ones that are healing from birth. And so our partners can play a big role in kind of managing the household and managing other children that we have and supporting our ability to heal. So for me, my husband is really big on cooking, and he takes managing our older kids and feeding me very seriously as a part of his role after our birth. And we're also very fortunate that our husbands get paternity leave from the Army. And so with our first, he only got about 3 days of the 10 days that he was supposed to have. And then by the time our son was born, it had increased to 3 weeks of paternity leave. And so for both Owen and Sophie, my husband got 3 weeks of paternity leave. And now the Army has it for 3 months for the partner, which is really awesome.
Super pumped.
Yeah. If for maternity leave, it used to be 6 weeks, and then it increased to 12 before I gave birth to Adeline about 5 or 6 years ago. And the paternity leave is now kind of increasing as well. And so I think maternity leave is even more than 12 at this point.
So my husband, with our first daughter, he had just got back from deployment. So they were still kind of doing all of that process of getting settled back in. So he got the full 3 weeks, And he really took on the role of like keeping our house clean and tidy, organizing meals, if not like organizing what we were going to eat for that night. So like ordering it if we needed to, and then taking care of our dogs. So at the time when our first and second kid, so Lily and Colin, when they were born, we had 2 dogs at the time. And so he kind of took on like ensuring they got walked every day. And it was also like really good for him to like get out of the house and like get some fresh air, because he was, running a lot more things that he was used to. But it was nice for me not to have to worry about like, oh, I hope that the dogs are also like not getting neglected now that we have this new baby or new babies in our lives. And then when we had our second child, he took on the task of ensuring that our daughter was entertained throughout the day. So not just like household tasks, but also entertained. But the only issue, he did not get the full 3 weeks with my son, so our second birth, because he had just started his master's degree. So he got about 5 days of paternity leave before he started back at school. So thankfully, my mom was able to help in the meantime, since he was not able to help when he was in class.
Let's take a break from this week's episode to hear about our sponsors. Crossover Symmetry offers world-class training and equipment for pain, fitness, and performance. We have a Crossover Symmetry shoulder system on every power rack in our gym because it has been so beneficial for our perinatal clients to support their shoulder health. Crossover Symmetry provides shoulder bands with several types of attachments, such as a door anchor for home or travel use, squat rack attachments, and also wall mounts. In addition to their equipment, Crossover Symmetry offers training programs to guide you to strong, pain-free shoulders, and even a 4-week postpartum program created by yours truly. Crossover Symmetry is our chosen brand in the gym, and we recommend them to all our clients. Check them out at crossoversymmetry.com and use code MamasteFit for 20% off your own system. Needed is a nutrition company focused on providing optimal nourishment for the perinatal journey. Did you know that during pregnancy, you need upwards of 100 grams of protein a day to support your pregnancy? The type of protein you consume also matters. Collagen is an optimal form of protein for pregnancy. It has the right amino acids to support skin stretching as your belly grows, as well as recovery from birth, whether vaginal or cesarean. Most of us don't consume enough collagen in our diet, and this is where a high-quality supplement comes in. Needed makes my favorite collagen protein for the perinatal stage. Needed's collagen is also third-party tested for heavy metals, which is important for any supplement you are consuming during pregnancy and postpartum. To get started with Needed's collagen, head to thisisneeded.com and use code MamastePod for 20% off your first 3 months of Needed. I will say though, in the early postpartum, I did find myself getting like really frustrated that everyone else could just leave and go do things without having to think about the baby or like their body parts falling out. So that was something that I kind of like was struggling with in the beginning, was like my husband could just get up and like go run this errand or take care of this like random task, while like I was kind of like stuck at home because I couldn't leave the baby without like coordinating with anybody else. So that was something that I kind of struggled with the early days. Was there anything that you struggled with the early days?
So both my kids had breastfeeding issues, so it was really just like dealing with that in like such an early period postpartum of like worrying if I was feeding my baby enough, and also it was hurting a ton. And then because of their tongue ties, I was not sleeping as much. So it was just like so frustrating because it was probably the hardest part was like what I envisioned my postpartum period being like was not what had actually occurred. But it's also important to note, like we keep talking about how you should like rest and stay in bed for like these first 2 weeks postpartum, but you will probably have to leave your house at some point for like appointments for the baby, or like if you want to take baby to like see a chiropractor or get like a cranial sacral therapy massage. Like those are reasons that you're probably going to have to leave your house because that involves the baby, and you can't really separate yourself from the baby. So like your partner can't take the baby to the newborn visit because that could potentially be 3 to 4 hours that you're separated from your baby, and they're probably going to get hungry in that time period. So there are times that you will probably have to leave your house to go to that 2-day baby appointment, go to the 2-week baby appointment. And if you make like chiropractic appointments or cranial sacral therapy appointments in between that time period, you would have to go to those appointments. So we both took our kids to the chiropractor within the first week after birth. And then my daughter, I took to cranial sacral therapy like very often within that first month postpartum. So it's okay to leave your house if like you have this appointment that you need to go to, but I wouldn't like, schedule a facial at like 3 days postpartum to like, hey, I'm just going to go get a facial at 3 days postpartum for fun. Or, hey, I need to go like to this appointment to grab something from Best Buy just for fun. Like I would never like schedule an appointment that did not have like a purpose.
So don't go buy a TV at 2 days postpartum. If you do have to leave your house, wearing like a belly band or like perineal support can be really helpful as well to give you that little bit of extra support if you do have higher demands. And so that's something else to consider as well. Like if you don't have the support to help you rest in those first 2 weeks postpartum, having like external support devices can be super helpful. So let's say like your partner doesn't get paternity leave and you live really far from family and no one can come and help you. Like wearing a belly band and a perineal support garment can help provide some support as you kind of tend to the things around your house, especially if you have like a toddler in addition to like a newborn baby. And so one of the really nice things about not giving birth in a hospital was one, I felt like I got more rest because when I was in the hospital, like day 1 postpartum, I felt like someone was like busting into the room like every 30 minutes to rub my fundus. And I actually didn't totally understand what my fundus was. And so some nurse like told my husband, like, make sure that she does some fundal massage because her uterus can flip over. And so he tells me this and I'm like, what is a fundal massage? And so we're like YouTubing, like trying to figure out what a fundal massage is because we don't want my uterus to flip and be upside down. So giving birth at home was nice because I didn't have like a crazy nurse telling me like all sorts of stuff.
But also, Gina has a baby. Her sister is a labor and delivery nurse who also was postpartum for 3 years. You think that she would think, hey, I should ask Roxanne what the heck a fundal massage is instead of YouTubing it.
Yeah, I was like rubbing my belly and massaging it, trying to
there were a lot of things that Gina probably should have asked me for some advice on, but...
So the really nice part about giving birth at home was one, someone wasn't busting into my room every 15 minutes to scare me. But my midwife and her birth assistant actually came to my house for the first 2 weeks to do our visits. So they came at 24 hours, like 3 days, 7 days, and then 2 weeks. And so I didn't need to go to my pediatrician at 2 days or 2 weeks with my baby because midwives can provide newborn care for up to like the first month postpartum. And then we also had like a really great friend that actually came to our house to do cranial psychotherapy on our baby. And so the benefits of doing like chiropractic care or CST on your baby is that birth is also like physically traumatic for them. And so doing like these minor adjustments can help kind of release tension, and sometimes it makes breastfeeding easier, which was the case for us. And so I definitely found that after an adjustment, my baby was able to relax a lot more. Not everybody's into it, but that was our personal experience and is the experience of a lot of our friends as well. So if you're like, what is this woo-woo stuff that they're talking about? Like we do find that getting chiropractic adjustments for your baby shortly after birth. And then if you have cranial psychotherapy available in your area that's for babies, that can really support your breastfeeding and your feeding journey. So to recap, for the first 2 weeks postpartum, we're mostly just laying in bed or we're laying near our bed, really emphasizing resting, diaphragmatic breathing, some gentle mobility to just move our spine because you can start to feel like super stiff from being in like one position for long periods of time. And then really asking for lots of help if possible. And then if you don't have a lot of support near you, like wearing like a belly band or perineal support can be helpful to provide that external support as your body is healing. So after the first 2 weeks postpartum, we're probably starting to get like a little stir crazy and wanting to leave our house. And so continuing to just lay in bed and do nothing is really not going to be incredibly beneficial for you anymore. Like we want to get up and start moving our body. And so starting around week 3 or 10 to 14 days postpartum, we can start increasing movement, such as going for like short walks. As you do these walks, monitor bleeding, ensure that it's not like increasing significantly. Like maybe like a little bit is okay, but it shouldn't be like clots or like bright red by any means. So as we increase activity, one way that we can tell if we are doing too much is to monitor our bleeding. So what should we be watching for, Roxanne, to monitor our bleeding? How do we know when it's an issue, like when we're doing too much? When should we call our provider when it comes to postpartum bleeding?
So with postpartum bleeding, reasons to go see your provider for it during any time postpartum is if you are saturating a pad in less than 1 to 2 hours. So I'm not talking about like panty liners. I'm talking about a real like full on menstrual pad. If you are filling that in less than 1 to 2 hours, that is concerning. You should definitely go and be seen. If you are passing any clots that are bigger than like, I would say an egg for the first couple of days, that is concerning, and you should either reach out to your provider or go in and be seen, especially if you're also having that increased bleeding with the saturating of the pads. So our bleeding is going to gradually become less and less as the days goes on, and it's going to change color and consistency throughout the first 4 to 6 weeks probably. Everyone kind of has a different timeline of how long they're going to be bleeding for, but on average, it's about 4 to 6 weeks for most of us. The first 5 days is more of that bright red bleeding, and it's like the first day of your period, first or second day of your period, that it's a little bit heavier and becomes less and less gradually. Then it's going to slowly start to change into more of like a dark brown or dark red consistency. This is like a old blood color. This means the blood has just been there for a while. And then it's going to slowly go into more of like a pink tinge to clear, almost yellow kind of color. And then the last and the longest phase is this white color. And this is because that wound that's in our uterus where our placenta was attached, that is the wound that is healing, and that is what's causing all of this discharge. So just like if you scraped your knee, that knee goes through a different process. It's not bleeding the entire time that it's healing. It goes through different cycles. So that same healing process is happening within our uterus, where it's just a little different of an environment. So it's in that moist environment. So we see all of the different stages versus if you scrape your knee, it's a dry environment and it's just that scab. And all of this is happening just underneath that scab. So you just don't see it. So a sign that you are doing too much activity too soon is if your bleeding slowed down, like you had that gradual decrease in bleeding, or it has stopped being bright red. So now you're in that phase where it's either pink tinge or almost yellow to clear. And then you increase your activity and you start to have bright red bleeding again. This could be a sign that you're doing too much too soon and that uterine wound is not ready for the amount of activity that you're doing. So you'll either have increased bleeding or start to have some clots because it's almost like you broke open that scab within your uterus and that's what's causing that bleeding.
So in addition to incorporating walks to begin to move our bodies postpartum, we can also begin to incorporate gentle core exercises, which is going to help us integrate more of this breath to movement coordination.
What does breath to movement mean?
And so breath to movement means that the way that I am breathing is coordinating with how my body is also moving. And so this is the foundation to returning to fitness after birth. The way that we breathe and how we coordinate it to the movement that we were doing is going to enhance our stabilization, it's going to increase our strength, and it's going to improve our performance. And so when I am eccentrically loading or lengthening my body, so I'm stretching my muscles, I want to inhale to increase pressure. This increase in pressure is going to better stabilize my spine. So pressure is the best way that we can stabilize our spine. And so if you watch somebody who's lifting really heavy weight, they inhale to take a really big breath into their thoracic cavity, and then they hold their breath as they maintain this increased intra-abdominal pressure or increased pressure within their abdominal cavity as they lower the weight, and then they stand back up, and then they take an exhale, because inhalations and that increase in pressure is going to be the best way to stabilize our spine. Inhalations are also the eccentric loading portion of our breath, and so we want to match that to when we are lengthening. The other half of this is going to be the concentric loading, or the shortening portion of our movement, matching that with the muscular activation portion of our breath, which is the exhalation. And so when it comes to incorporating this breath to movement with our core exercises, we're focusing on, can we maintain our torso position as our arms and legs move? And so we started with that diaphragmatic breathing where we're inhaling down to feel the core expand and the pelvic floor load and lengthen. And then we're exhaling to kind of lift everything up and in, or we're exhaling to relax. Now we can begin to do some gentle core exercises that are going to involve one arm moving, one leg moving, just the hips lifting as we exhale. And so we want to coordinate our breath to the movement that we're having with our arms or our legs. And so typically we want to exhale as we move into like the harder part of the movement, or the portion of the movement where we want to maintain our rib to pelvic position. And so usually it's when you're extending your arm overhead, when we're extending in the hip. So it tends to involve a lot of like extension, which is muscular activation or more of that concentric or shortening movement. And then we want to inhale when we're coming back to our starting positions. And so we're exhaling as we extend our arm overhead, and then we're inhaling as we bring the arm back to the starting position. And so we can begin to incorporate that in our early postpartum rehab as kind of the precursor to our return to fitness, because again, the foundation to all our movement is how can we breathe and stabilize our spine and maintain our torso's position as our arms and legs do different types of functional movement. And so in this early postpartum period, all of the movements that you're doing, the breathing drills, the mobility, the core exercises, it's really unstructured. So we're not doing any rounds or reps. We're just exploring the movement in our body. Maybe you do 3 reps one time, maybe you do like 5 breaths another time. And so if you want more of like a plan to loosely follow, to just give you more ideas of like what type of breathing drills to do or mobility drills to do or core exercises to do, you can join our free early postpartum recovery course. It's broken down by week to week. So it's a 4-week program that is like, try these 3 movements this week, try these 3 movements the next week. And so it's a very general guide. It's not a do this on this day for 8 times. And it can just give you some ideas on like how to reintroduce movement to your body as you begin this early healing process. And so when I reflect on my early postpartum period, especially with my first, where I didn't have MamasteFit yet, I didn't know all this stuff yet, I actually did rest early postpartum, which was like super strange for my personality. And if anyone knew me before I was pregnant, I was known for doing some really silly fitness things, such as like getting lost on a run and like accidentally running 16 miles for fun. I came home from a 10-month deployment where my longest run was like 3 miles, and I did a 40-mile ultra marathon because my friend was like, do you want to do this with me? And I was like, yeah, that sounds super fun. So it was pretty wild that after my birth, I was suddenly like, let me just rest my body and let my body heal. Like, who am I?
Honestly, though, it was probably because Gina was sleep deprived. She told me, I remember that one of the nurses, this is probably a trend, told her to set an alarm for every 2 hours and wake her baby up to feed her for forever, I guess, like did not give her a timeline. And so Gina continued to do that for her entire first month of postpartum.
I remember asking Roxanne, like, hey, like, I was told that I need to wake her up and feed her, like, throughout the night. Like, I'm setting alarms. Like, when am I allowed to stop that? Like, when do people normally stop doing that? And Roxanne, like, looked at me and was like, you're doing what? Like, Gina, please stop.
So normally the recommendation is to wake your baby up every like 2 to 3 hours until they regain back to their birth weight, just like to ensure that they're adequately gaining weight. But most babies will return to their birth weight within like the first week postpartum. And Adeline, I remember, returned to her birth weight like at 2 or 3 days after birth. So Gina continued to wake her up every 2 to 3 hours, even though she was fine.
So I was waking my baby up in the middle of the night to feed her every 2 hours for almost a month. And it would take me like an hour and a half to feed her, to like get her to lay back down, and then the alarm would go off again. So I was pretty exhausted and like borderline delusional. So yeah, once I got some sleep, I regained who I was again, because at a month postpartum, I was like, I ran ultra marathons. I was a collegiate runner. I'm just going to go for this casual 2-mile run, which was my warm-up distance when I was in college, which was, 10 years ago. So I don't know who I thought I was. So yeah, at 1 month postpartum, I tried to go for a 2-mile run, and about 3 minutes into that run, my pelvic floor was like, nah, bro, you need to go home. And I walked my happy ass home.
Gina was pretty optimistic. I remember she texted me and was like, yeah, I think I'm going to go for like a run. And I was like, okay, that didn't sound like a really great idea, but I supported her in whatever she wanted to do. And then she came back and was like, I think I ran for maybe 5 minutes total. And I was like, probably could have told you that. 2 miles was pretty overzealous. You also haven't ran for 9 months.
Yeah, it was not a good look for me. So don't do that. That's not what we recommend. So now that we have made it out of the early postpartum period, so once you're like 4 to 10 weeks postpartum, I would say that you're out of like early postpartum. Initial tissue healing has happened and we are ready to move our bodies in a more structured way. And so once your postpartum bleeding has stopped, you can maybe look at returning to the gym and starting to return to your preferred sport. And so maybe this is 4 weeks postpartum, maybe this is like 10 weeks postpartum. With my first, I was about 4 weeks when my bleeding stopped. And so I began to like slowly integrate back into my workouts. For my second, my bleeding didn't stop closer to like 6 weeks. And I didn't really see like a big difference between my two postpartum healing timelines. If anything, my second postpartum was easier healing wise. And so when you stop bleeding doesn't always mean like you did something wrong, quote unquote. And so my workouts were a little delayed for my second postpartum at like 6 weeks. And then with this most recent postpartum period, I started working out again around 4 weeks because my bleeding had stopped at that point.
So for me, I was not smart in my first postpartum recovery, that initial postpartum recovery. So my bleeding did go on for, I think, like 4 to 7 weeks, but it like stopped and then would increase again and stopped and increased again. Knowing what I know now is because I was trying to do too much too soon, like go TV shopping with my husband who takes like months to make a decision. I thought that he would make a quick decision in the store. That was silly of me. And then also go to a wedding at 1 week postpartum because that was a great idea. And if you go to weddings, you know, like you're not like laying down at them. No one lays down at weddings. And then also attend a class. So like my bleeding would like decrease and then I would go do one of these activities and surprisingly, it would increase again. So I was just bleeding for, I feel like forever with my first. And then like returning back to activity took me probably like, I think I went back to the gym at 2 or 3 months postpartum and it just did not feel right. And then I don't think that I returned again until probably like 6 months postpartum to actually do the postpartum return to fitness because my recovery was just like derailed from all of the activities that I had to do immediately postpartum. With my second, though, I was way smarter because I learned after my first. I stayed in bed, except for one day we went and took photos. That was like the only thing that I did where I had to leave my house. But I stayed in bed pretty much for like the first like month postpartum. My bleeding stopped around 4 to 5 weeks postpartum, and I was able to immediately move into the postpartum return to fitness program. And I didn't have any like complications at all with that recovery process like I did with my first.
And so let's explore how we can return to workouts postpartum. And so there are a few ways that we can approach returning to workouts. One, we do this all for you in our postpartum fitness programs, depending on how you like to work out. But you can also kind of integrate these concepts into your own programming as well. And so the first thing that we want to do is we want to relearn movement patterns. And so this is a really great opportunity to kind of train out like poor movement habits that you've had from previous lifetimes, previous pre-pregnancy. And so when relearning a movement pattern, we're going to start first with limited range of motion. And we can also think about decreasing the number of joints that are moving. And so this is going to allow us to really focus on coordinating that breath to movement. If I just have less things moving, there's less things to think about stabilizing. And so, for example, we can do like a kneeling squat where you're on your knees and you're extending in your hip and your knees instead of your hip, knees, and ankle. And then we're going to progress to a box squat. So this will be decreased range of motion. We're not going down quite as far. And then eventually progressing to a full squat. So you're starting with that kneeling squat where only 2 main joints are moving, to a box squat where all 3 joints are moving. So ankle, knee, and hip, but we're not going down quite as far. And then progressing towards the squat. And then you can add on different like loading variations as well from there. The second thing that we can do is we can focus on stabilization and strength endurance. So our postpartum programs include one strength exercise such as a squat, deadlift, hip thrust, anything that's like bilateral. So 2 limbs are moving at the same time. And then we pair it with a stabilization exercise or a single leg or core focused exercise such as squats with step-ups. And so we would do 10 squats followed by 10 step-ups per leg as our main lift movement. That's followed with that stabilization exercise. And so this usually means a higher volume at lower weight at first. So we're doing like 10 squats with 8 step-ups per leg, 8 squats with 6 step-ups per leg. And so I find that this rep scheme of anywhere from like 8 to 12 for the main lift and then 6 to 10 for the stabilization exercise to be really successful at helping my clients regain their strength postpartum while keeping it at a intensity level that allows them to maintain really good form. Because returning to postpartum fitness is very mental, because you have to think about all these things again. I have to think about how I am breathing, how my pelvic floor and core is moving as I do this movement. And so we're at the very, very basic and the beginning portion of relearning movement patterns and having to coordinate our breath to movement that eventually will become more second nature in like a few months. And so it's really important that we approach it in this way. And we found it to be like really successful for our clients. The last thing that we want to be focusing on with the return to fitness aspect is we want to reintroduce impact slowly. So with impact, which is essentially anything like jumping or running, we need to focus on glute and hip musculature strengthening. So can the hips and legs support the movement without your pelvic floor freaking out? If we're experiencing leakage where you're like peeing when you jump or when you run, it could be because the pelvic floor is too tight and clenched, which could occur if our glutes or hip musculature are not strong enough to support the pelvis. And so if the hip musculature is not strong enough, the pelvic floor is going to clench to help stabilize. And if there's too much tension within the pelvic floor, it doesn't have that elasticity to respond to the demand and changes in pressure, which is going to result in leakage. And so there are a lot of factors that could contribute towards like leaking or incontinence, but the pelvic floor being too tight is just one of the many reasons. So if you think about what is the end movement that I'm trying to work towards, we can develop a progression to reach that movement by focusing on the basics. So with the squat, if we think about what components are involved in that movement, we have hip and knee flexion as we lower, plus tons of spinal stability and ankle mobility. And so we need our ankle, knee, and hip to all stabilize in our legs as we support this movement. And then we add in some upper body activation. So you can see this is a pretty complex compound movement. And so if we focus on each of these components, starting with the closest to the spine, breathing. So first we're going to focus on, can I properly move my diaphragm in coordination with my pelvic floor and core, which is something that we can do early postpartum. And then can I move my arms and legs as I breathe and coordinate this movement? Can we start with just the hip and knee moving and then add in the ankles movement, and then we're going to increase the range of motion, and then we add some weights. And so you can see there's already like 4 to 5 steps to this single progression just to get back to the squat. And we can do this with every movement we want to achieve. And so when we start looking at more complex movements like Olympic lifts or dynamic movements like running, the progressions start to get a little bit longer because there's so many more little components to it that we want to become experts at before we really progress. And so running is a bounding from leg to leg movement. This requires tons of single leg stability and strength, torso rotation that's going to counter to hip rotation. And so starting at the basics again, we want to start with the spine. So can we breathe to stabilize the spine? Now, can our arms and legs move as our torso remains in its position in coordination with our breath? And then can we focus on a stability progression, such as 2 legs to a staggered stance to 1 leg? Because if we feel stable, our pelvic floor and our glute won't clench in response to feeling unsafe. We can then add some impact, so like 2 legs to 1 leg to different directions, adjusting the height of the jump, the speed of the jump, and so on. And so you can see that there's a lot that can go into returning to fitness postpartum. And so just returning to the gym at 6 weeks and doing everything like you did pre-pregnancy just with lighter weight is not a great approach. We want to really break it down to what are the basics of this movement that I'm trying to work back towards, and how can I rebuild myself over a period of like 2 to 4 months. And so postpartum return to fitness is very slow. It's a very patient process, but it can be worth it in the long run. So you're going to feel stronger in the long run. You're going to run faster in the long run because you're going to be able to kind of work out all those poor movement habits that you had from pre-pregnancy. And so for me personally, being patient with my postpartum return to fitness has made me a better athlete in the long run. So I'm lifting heavier than I did pre-pregnancy. I'm running faster-ish. Like I'm not running as fast as I did when I was a collegiate runner, obviously, but I don't have the same aches and pains that I had pre-pregnancy because I have trained my body out of those poor movement habits. And I obviously still have some like compensation patterns that exist that will probably exist for a really long time. It would be unrealistic to say, oh, if I just do these 10 exercises, I'll be like perfect. And so as you can see, this return to fitness process can be pretty complex. There's a lot of progressions that are involved depending on how many movements you're trying to get back to. And so if you want some more support with this, where you're like, I already feel very overwhelmed, we do have our postpartum fitness programs that can help you make it back to the movements that you want to do again. And so our programs are going to be primarily focused on strength training, and we have different delivery variations, whether you like to work out with an app that's like self-paced and it's just a list of exercises with demo videos. We have a short and a long version of that. Or if you like to watch full-length workout videos that you work out with at the same time, we have an on-demand program. So we have different options depending on how you like to work out. And then we also have sport-specific programs. So if you do want to get back to running, or if you want to get back to Olympic weightlifting, or if you're a first responder or in the military, like there's different demands for your career field, we have programs to support that return to your sport and return to your career. And so if you want that extra support, we do have those options available on our website. But most importantly, it's worth being patient with this process. I would say for me, usually around like 4 to 5 months postpartum is when I start to feel ready to do any sort of like significant impact type work, such as running or jumping. Before then, I usually feel like my pelvic floor is just going to fall out of my body. And so being very patient with these progressions was very, very important to me.
How long do you think it took you to feel normal again? I know for me, I started to feel kind of like normal and myself again when I got my period back. And so for my first, that was around like 13 months. And then my second, it was around 14 months postpartum. But what was it like for you?
I would say closer to 18 months was when I started to feel like myself again after both my first and my second. Around 18 months was when I felt really good and felt like I could physically do anything, but maybe I was just being like overly cautious and didn't really want to push myself until kind of that point. With my first, I got my period back at like 13 months. And then with my second, it was around like 5 months when I got it back. So I'm kind of like anticipating my period to return like any day now with this postpartum. This postpartum, I do feel like my healing has been better than the previous two. Not that I've done anything like super significant, other than I really feel like I've done better at like letting go of my ego this time frame, where I am just like, I was really focused on healing those early days. And then I've been like very patient with the progression so far. I do think I'm going to start pushing weights closer to like a year postpartum as opposed to waiting for that 18 months.
I think I started incorporating like running again this past postpartum, which I was never able to do with my first postpartum around like 8 or 9 months. And then I did that half marathon when I was like 19 months postpartum. And that felt like that whole training felt really good. And I do attribute a lot of it to like the fact that I was really slow and intentional with my recovery the second time around. And then obviously Gina's just amazing programming that she does for the postpartum fitness and then the return to running. But I do think like knowing what I did my first postpartum, where it literally took me probably over a year just to actually start working out again, because my recovery, we could probably do an entire episode on just like my prolapse journey and all of that with my first, and then comparing it to my second, where I was like kind of back to working out or like 3 or 4 months really pretty consistently, that I attribute a lot of it to being very intentional and actually resting and moving slowly through the progressions.
So there's a lot that we can do to support our return to fitness after birth, and it can start on day 1 postpartum. So you don't have to wait to the all clear to begin rehab type work. 4 to 6 weeks is too long to wait to start any sort of rehabilitation work. And it's also like too early to begin to like running to the gym. Like don't go to the gym at like 2 days postpartum, please. So in the early postpartum period, I would say before you get the all clear, we want to focus on resting, nourishment, and like gentle movement for our body. And so incorporating that diaphragmatic breathing in different positions, that mobility work in different positions, and then integrating that core movement. So those core exercises just to begin to coordinate that breath to movement. We can do some short walks starting at like week 3 and monitoring bleeding to assess, are we doing too much? Maybe can we do a little bit more? But in that early first month postpartum, really emphasizing the rest is so important to support our long-term healing, our long-term health, and ultimately our return to fitness. as we begin to return to the gym, whenever we get cleared and when our bleeding has stopped, it's really important that we start from the basics with the movements that we want to do. So when you are figuring out like, how am I going to get back to this pre-pregnancy exercise that I did, think about all the components of that exercise, and then how can you break it down to smaller pieces so that way you can rebuild, get rid of old movement, like poor movement habits, so that you can feel stronger and that you can move better this postpartum and that you can be a better athlete. And so it's a super patient process. It's worth it. It can be frustrating at times, especially if your healing gets derailed by something that's going on, like someone got sick, maybe you did too much one day. So we completely understand if you're feeling frustrated in your healing process. It's so patient. It feels like it's going to take forever, but it is 100% worth it. So thank you for being here with us, and thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow our podcast to be notified when we release new episodes. Leave a review, share with your friends. We release new episodes every Wednesday. If you want to learn more from us, be sure to check out our Instagram page at MamasteFit, where we share tons of reels and information on supporting your perinatal journey. If you want to explore our fitness programs, check them out at mamastefit.com/all-programs, where you can explore both our prenatal and our postpartum fitness programs.
This podcast is sponsored by Needed, a nutrition company focused on optimal nourishment for your perinatal journey, and Crossover Symmetry, world-class training and equipment for pain, fitness, and performance. You can use code MamastePod for 20% off your first Needed order and code MamasteFit for 20% off your Crossover Symmetry shoulder system.